I'm Corbett Wall with DV Auction, here with your feeder flash for Tuesday, November the 12th, brought to you in part by Bromvigen Commodities, more affectionately and better known as Bromcom. Call Candy Sullivan there in her office in the beautiful Bluegrass Stockyards Exchange building there in Lexington, Kentucky, and she can take care of you wherever you're at. If you need help with your hedges, if you're interested in speculating in some commodities, looks like we've got a continued run-up coming, especially as we come in here to the new year. But she can pretty much help you out with whatever you need. That's Bromvigen Commodities, and you can find them online at bromvigencommodities.com. Coming to you here on the road and beautiful downtown Melvin, Texas, as we're going to have the Ford Ranch dispersal on Tuesday. They've got over 700 head of Red Angus commercial cows going to be sold in lots, and you can log on and view and bid right there at dvauction.com at noon on Tuesday. But going to be moving on up into north part of Texas later in the week at Lone Star Angus there in Gainesville. What was going on this week? To start the week out, a cold snap. I mean, extremely cold, and they were having a ice storm there in Melvin, Texas on Monday night, and really cold. Cold wind just all through the plains, from the top to the bottom. I mean, just fierce cold winds just cut right through you. It did affect the market in a few places, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. We've got outstanding demand for our beef. It's just unbelievable. We didn't see this coming. We didn't know that we were going to be able to work through these numbers that we had, which have pretty much not really amounted to too much, the way that we've been able to work through these cattle. Even with that plant in Holcomb, Kansas still down, we are starting to hear rumblings about them getting ready to open back up. They did put out a notice this week that the fabrication and things that they've been doing in that plant and the work getting ready to kick back up is not going to happen on Tuesday because of an electrical problem. So they're still working through some things, but we're expecting that to come back on board here pretty soon. And what's going to happen then when we get another plant with new renovations that's going to be able to harvest up to 6,500 head a day on top of what we've been doing, and we've just got good things to come fundamentally. Let's look at the board on Monday. Live cattle futures for December up 62 cents at 192 or 119.87. That's scaring the heck out of $1.20. And we're there, guys. We're getting pretty close. We haven't got the cash market quite there yet, but we're going to work on that some more here this week. February live cattle up 65 cents at 125.67, and that sounds pretty good too. November feeder cattle up 57 cents at 147.57. January up $1.25 at 147.12. Your weighted average on last week's negotiated 5 area, huge volume. You know, it hasn't been that long ago we could do this in each individual 5 area, but in this day and time, to move 99,100 head is big, and that's by far the biggest we've seen since the plant closed due to fire there in Holcomb, Kansas, due to all the shakeout that we've seen since. But 99,100 head in this day and time is a pretty good negotiated movement in the 5 area. That compares to 75,800 last week and 92,500 the same week a year ago. And the prices were quite a bit higher. You look at your weighted average prices, your price range on steers and heifers through the 5 area feeding region last week was 112 all the way up to 117.50, but mostly 114 to 116. We saw more 114 in Kansas, but then it turned to 115. We saw just a dribble in Texas at 114, mostly all 115 in Texas. Late in the week, we saw more 116 live in your northern plains, especially in western Nebraska, Colorado out that way at 116. But good movement there. But your weighted average price on live steers was $114.60 for last week's trade. That was up $1.57 compared to the weighted average from the previous week. Your dress trade Your sales of dressed steers and heifers last week in your 5 area ranged from 176 to 185, was mostly 181 to 182. Largely 181 from your majors. The 182 was mostly reserved for your regional packers, but still a pretty good price there, and it was definitely higher. Your weighted average on dressed steers was 181.04. That was up $1.65 from your dressed weighted average steer price from the week before. But if you take note, your weighted average dressed heifers was 181.92. So almost 182 there. So you see how that's kind of a change. But we continue to see more negotiated sales in your northern plains because you have small producers, and by and large your southern plains feedlots are big corporate feeders that sell under a formula program of some type. But we don't normally see it quite this big. But of that 99,000 head plus movement last week, 3/4 of them were in the north. And we think that we've got a lot of cattle that are ready in Kansas, and yes, maybe we do, but we're just not selling that many of them negotiated. And that's one reason that your weighted average steer price was under 115 at 114.60. If we'd have seen more significant negotiated trade in the southern plains, we could have gotten that higher. And then the guys that sell off the weighted average or the high for the week would have liked that, but we're just not seeing enough negotiated sales in our southern plains, and that just continues to be a problem that is whittling away at our industry as it trickles down to your other classes of cattle. Nationwide negotiated sales, if you go on the outside of the fringes and go all the way out to the great northwest and even back east, and your Pennsylvania Dutch feeders there in Pennsylvania and around, but nationwide 120,800 head negotiated sales. That's pretty darn good, and only 17.5% of those, or a little over 21,000, were for the 2 to 4 week delivery. They need the cattle right now, and they're just making so much money continuing to with these box beef cutout values zooming to levels that we just weren't prepared for. The way things that had been going, we kept thinking they were going to kind of stall out, and we've still got a lot of good export demand to look forward to before the end of the year. They're still continuing to buy for the holiday parties and things like that when people get out and celebrate before the holidays. What else is that demand coming from? It's starting to noticeably come in due to the ASF, or African swine fever, because there's just less protein around due to the massive numbers of swine that have been killed by that disease. And so we're starting to see it pick up a little bit and noticeably coming into your beef markets. We're also seeing where cattle are fed, kind of like what we do here, which it's not widely done other than in Canada. But in Australia, they do a bit of that, and Australia has been so dry. They're just really short because they've suffered through one of their worst droughts in history there. But box beef cutout values, like I said, continue to spike, and it's on the end items in the trim, not necessarily the middle meats, which is normally the driver of that. Now they're going to be more expensive, of course, but they're not driving the market like our trim is, that's eventually going to end up in our ground beef, and that's why you're seeing all-time record numbers of cows being harvested, because the most all of that product goes right into grinding, and we're just seeing so much demand coming from that. Let's talk about your feeder cattle markets. Your real-time index on Cattle Market Central late in the day on Monday set at 144.96, basically about steady with where it ended up at the end of last week, and that's through Monday's sales. So we haven't seen the index levels move all that much lately because there's so much volume in there. There's so many cattle selling. We talked earlier, or on the weekly visit, that last week's feeder cattle movement, calves and yearlings, but mostly calves, that was the biggest auction movement we'd seen since the first week of the year, after we'd been shut down for 2 weeks due to the holidays. So that's the second biggest auction movement we've seen in 2019 that comes all the way this late. but big sales continuing. But I tell you what, the cold snap kind of took its toll, and we've talked about in Oklahoma there. I tell you what, when that cold wind is blowing like that, it's hard to get people excited about new purchases. They're a little bit disappointed in the wheat pasture that they had such high hopes for just several weeks ago, but it's just been so cold. They've had some problem with bugs getting into the wheat, and it's just once you start turning some cattle out there, and most of the leased wheat won't get turned out until towards the end of this week, but a lot of guys that own the wheat have turned cattle out, and I tell you what they've grazed off is not growing back. It's just a little bit too dry, and we haven't had enough sunshine and warm days mixed in here, as we're looking like we're going to have kind of a cold winter. It's at least starting out that way, but really cold in Oklahoma City. That 8,300 head there, the cold snap hurt the market. Your steers, both feeder cattle and calves, steady to $4 lower. Feeder heifers $4 to $5 lower, and the heifer calves were mostly $2 lower. So a lower market there, despite higher fat cattle, despite continuing higher futures. And we talked about that on the weekly visit too. People haven't made money background and they're turning cattle out the last several times. They don't have the equity, they don't have the ability to borrow, and they're just not very excited about it. And so we're seeing that your lighter weights, your cattle that need grown, that need turned out, whether it be on wheat, dry wintered, or even put into a growing lot, those lighter weights are not bringing what you'd think they'd be bringing, considering what the board is, what fat cattle are doing, what our beef is doing, and everything. There's just not as many players out there as we've seen in recent years, and guys are kind of laying out and just don't have the ability to do it anymore. Joplin Regional Stockyards, 6,900 head there. Good sale for Joplin, and they were higher. They were sitting up there. You just get up into the edge of the Midwest, and then you start getting some buying going on up in there. The cold weather doesn't bother them near as much. Feeder steers in Joplin steady to $4 higher. And feeder heifers were unevenly steady, but close to what they were bringing a week ago. Steer calves are about steady, but heifer calves $3 to $5 lower there, and it's just the sheer volume of calves that are moving, and there's just not as many places to put them as the numbers that are showing up. And yes, trucks are a problem to get calves where they need to go, and there's just not a big availability of trucks. But talking about Joplin, be thinking about this primetime livestock video that's coming up November the 21st. They've got a good offering already on there. That sale is going to be at 1 o'clock p.m. PrimetimeLivestock.com, or you can go to dvauction.com and bid on that sale. But you can go on there and before the sale and look at some of the lots. They'll have them featured on there. But that primetime livestock video is really taking off. Another big sale further up into the northern plains, Faith, South Dakota, Faith Livestock Commission. Good run there, nearly 4,000 head. They've been having sales at the beginning of every week, big sales. Calves up there steady to $4 higher. More of the guys in the northern plains and in the Midwest are finishing up with their harvest. They're wanting to get in on some of those calves. Those calves have had a lot of weather on them already. They're pretty foolproof there, and you can sit in and buy some of those better long strings of calves out of those big sales up in the northern plains and feel pretty comfortable about not having a lot of trouble with them. And there is a lot of guys that are bringing calves from the Dakotas up in Nebraska and places like that, Wyoming, and bringing them down to the wheat further down into the southern plains. But you look at this market report from Cattle Market Central from Faith Livestock Commission there, and you see that they had a good run on your best tested weights of steers there. Look, nearly 1,200 head of 5-weight steers there, average 565 at 160.78. Included in that, which helped build it up, was one long string there, 103 head of 533-pound steers there in Faith, bring $170 even, and that's a pretty darn good price. Look at some 6-weight steers, 1,065 head of 6-weight steers, average 640 at 155.58. A couple of individual quotes come from Tri-State Livestock, McCook, Nebraska. 68 head of 893-pound feeder steers bring 150 and a quarter, and then some big calves there, 60 head of 766 pound big feeder calves there, and McCook, Nebraska, bring 161 and a quarter. That's your feeder flash for Tuesday.